I think one of the biggest lessons that I've taken away from the process of revising this story is that concessions and compromises are a fundamental part of the writing process. There was a time long before this, especially when I wrote my earlier drafts of this story, that I did not believe in any sort of concessions. I had the mentality of I, as the author creator, can more or less make the story however I want it, and it's my baby. I'm the creator. There's no to compromise and make any sort of concession at all is to compromise on my work. It is to compromise my art in a sense, and that mentality, I had to learn a kind of a hard lesson about that mentality. Invariably, it doesn't exist. You can't, if you're looking to get traditionally published, it's not going to happen. Obviously, with maybe the self-publishing realm, that's a bit different because you really can control everything. You really don't have to change anything about your story at all. You can put it up just as it is. But especially if you're looking to be traditionally published, it's a huge part of the process, especially later on, is learning to be emotionally able to accept a compromise on something. And it can be everything from a change in the story as far as the story structure to, how the story is told, and more on the prose side of things, as is the case with Tarot. Not too much of the story structure needed to be altered, but a lot of it was just the way it was told. In some ways, that's a little bit easier. The second part's a little bit easier because you're keeping at least the content of your story the same. So if you're someone that believes a lot in the content of the story and doesn't necessarily mind about how the story is told, well, that makes it a little bit easier. For me, at least, it was a little bit easier, I guess, in that regard. However, my inability to compromise is actually what sort of landed me in this position. I mentioned before that with the earlier drafts of this story, I actually was, for a short time, in talks with an agent, and we just weren't able to come to an agreement after having a Zoom conference because I was not willing to make those sort of concessions. Again, I mentioned this before, but they were the exact same ones that have been brought up now. So what needed to be changed really didn't need to be changed, or what needed to be changed basically did not vary from one to the other. So the fact that two people are telling you this, that two different entities are telling you this, indicates that this is going to be an area you're going to have to change regardless. So for me, it ended up costing me, in part, I guess, an agent, in a way. So it ended up basically costing me an agent at first, and now I'm slowly making the concessions now that I am sort of moving on to a smaller publisher at this time. Certainly nothing, certainly a lesson that's worth learning. I'm not bitter or anything about that, basically. But as a point of fact, if I had perhaps listened the first time, if I had made those sort of changes the first time, I wouldn't necessarily be in this scenario. I could have maybe done that. I could have maybe been in a better position than I am now. My point in telling you this is simply that there's going to come a point in the process, if you're fortunate enough to get that far, where you're probably going to have to make changes. And there's going to be a part of you that's not going to want to do it. And I'd actually be more fearful of the person that's willing to make too many changes. So if you're someone, when every single change is mentioned, that you just say yes every single time, I'd actually be more fearful of that, because you need to have some fight for your story. You do have to have an element of being willing to fight for some of the content of your story. You shouldn't just be kind of rolling over basically for every single thing that gets brought up. With that being said, though, the attitude of being willing to make those sort of concessions and being willing to compromise on at least a few things, if not more than that, it does indicate a level of maturity with your writing, and that will get you a lot further. So be cautious of being too willing to make changes, just because I I feel like you're going to at some point change something that maybe you shouldn't, that maybe that's going to bother you, or you may not have perhaps as deep a connection to the story, or maybe you are just really, really disconnected, like in a very healthy way, which is great. I certainly, I certainly am not. I still keep a little bit of a connection to my story. There are certain things I would not compromise on, but concessions are part of it. Compromises with agents, with publishers are part of the game, and you've got to learn to deal with that. And the best, I guess, advice is, write the first few drafts for yourself, and then write the later drafts for the publisher, for the agent. Write it for them. In a sense, look for things that they may prematurely not like, right? Like, look at your work and prematurely go, all right, an agent or an editor in the past has said this, my writing, they may not like this element that I've put in this story. I've read somewhere that agents don't like this sort of thing. Maybe I should change that. Be willing to make those small little changes. And you don't always have to do it right at that point. You can have an agent or editor tell you that. But the more changes you make before you send it to them, the better your piece is going to look. So it's a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a tightrope. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the story right now. Like I'm looking at how many things I've changed now, and just thinking to myself, man, if like a year and a half ago, if I had done this, what would have been different? So again, it's a good lesson. It's something I want to kind of impart to other people. Having gone through this, I don't want someone else to go through the same scenario. It sucks to, as accepting as I am my situation, it does suck to hear twice the same thing from two different people, and to know that if you listened the first time, you would have been better off. But again, that's why these sort of lessons exist, and certainly it's not the end of the world or anything like that. But yeah, if you're going to be a writer, you're looking to become traditionally published, compromises are part of the process, and you cannot be a temperamental artist that is not willing to make any changes at all to your work.